Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining today and taking the time to learn a bit more about this fun yet complex work of art by Roy Lichtenstein. The title of this work is Mr. Bellamy. It was painted in 1961. And when we look at the painting, it will perhaps look fairly straightforward, fairly simple, but hopefully when we get done, you'll understand that it's much more complex than that. Now, before we look at the work itself, it's best that we take a few minutes and discuss the artist, Roy Lichtenstein. Now, Roy Lichtenstein was born in New York City on the Upper West Side. He was born into a very much middle-class family. His father was a real estate agent. His mother was a homemaker. He attended elementary, junior high, and high school in New York City. And while he was in school, one of the things he enjoyed doing was traveling to Harlem to the Apollo Theater to listen to jazz music. At the same time, he also was very much aware of the fact, he was very interested in art and aware of the fact that he would want to become an artist. His parents encouraged him, but they'd also asked him to have something to fall back on, so they talked him into not only being an artist, but perhaps he could learn to teach art as well. He left New York City and went to Ohio State University in the Midwest. At that point in time, New York was not quite yet the art mecca that it would soon become, so he left and went to the Midwest. Now, he attended Ohio State, and in that time, he took 3 years out and was in the U.S. Army during World War II. And in that period of time, he was trained as a pilot. Now, he never flew in combat, but he did know a lot about the military, and he did know a lot about airplanes. And we'll see that will become later in his work, that became very important. He went back to Ohio State, graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, went on to receive his Master of Fine Arts, and taught at Ohio State for 1 year. From there, he went on to a university in Oswego, New York, and taught for a period, and finally ended up at the Douglas campus at Rutgers University in New Jersey as a professor of art. Now, during all of this, he discussed that his influences, two of the main influences in his career, were Pablo Picasso and Piet Mondrian. He would also later discuss that Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns also had a fair amount of influence on his work. And as a professor, he was also very well acquainted with art history, and because of this, he did a lot of experimenting with his art. He worked in the Cubist style, was very well aware of, and worked in the abstract expressionist movement. In this particular work, The Explorer, 1952, I think you could look in the background and perhaps see the influence of Picasso. Perhaps not as much Mondrian at this point, although be patient. But what's interesting about this particular work is that it is a takeoff from an advertisement for Libby, McNeil, and Libby's cooked corned beef. It was published in Life magazine in 1949. And you can see that what he did was he took the original advertisement and modified it, changed it, made it abstract, made it his own painting. And what we know from this is that through this period, through the period of the 50s, Roy Lichtenstein was searching for what his niche would be, searching for his genre, his place in the art world. Now, his young sons suggested to him that he draw some cartoons. You could get bubblegum wrappers that had cartoons in them in that day and age, and his young sons would get those, and they would suggest to him that perhaps he could draw some of those. Well, in the summer of 1961, he painted Look Mickey. Now, as a college professor, he likely had the summer off. His experimentation and his search likely went into high gear, and he then came up with Look Mickey. It's basically a one-off. It's an original. He had been dabbling in these sorts of characters and interested in these sorts of characters for some period of time. In this particular painting, we can see the text balloon very prominently in the upper left corner. We can also see the influence of Mondrian in the coloring. The colors are very basic. The painting here was done likely in June or July of that summer. Later in the year of 1961, he painted Mr. Bellamy, the subject of this discussion. Now, we know this was painted at least in the fall, probably late fall, maybe October, November, that this one was completed. And we'll see why we know that in a minute. But what we do see here is a bit of a change, because now this is clearly a military officer. And when we look at this, first blush, it looks fairly simple. Looks like a fairly simple painting. And when I tour this, I always ask people, what do they see? When we're touring it in the gallery, the comments are virtually always either comic or cartoon. And if pressed further, typically what I'll get out of museum patrons is military officer, something to that effect. Well, where did Roy Lichtenstein get the idea for this painting? Well, Michael Lobel is a professor of art history at Bard College. And in searching for information in his dissertation, he was looking at duplication of art, specifically with Roy Lichtenstein, for his dissertation, and he was able to find the source of this. The source was a comic strip. The strip was named Thorne McBride. It ran for about 2 years as a national syndication out of California. It was drawn by Mel Kiefer. This particular strip would have run in a New Jersey newspaper on August 5th of 1961. And you can see the far pane in the strip is likely the source. I think we can agree that's the source of the painting. Now, in the text balloon from the officer, it says, "I'm supposed to report to a Charles Faber. I wonder what he is like." That's important. That whole scene is important, and we'll understand why in a minute. But at this point, the question then becomes, sort of to me, the elephant in the room is, well, is Mr. Bellamy, the painting, simply a copy of a comic strip? Well, let's table that question for now. We'll go down through the painting, and then I'll try to answer that in a little more detail at the end of this presentation. So I want to start, as we dissect this painting, with the text balloon. Remember that the individual was Charles Faber. Here, it's I'm supposed to report to a Mr. Bellamy. I wonder what he's like. Well, this in the art world had significant meaning at the time, in New York especially, because Richard Bellamy was one of the movers and shakers in the art world. He was the director of the Green Gallery for 5 years in the early 60s. And it was widely known that he could make or break an artist. Is this an homage, perhaps, to Mr. Bellamy by the artist Lichtenstein? Is this tongue-in-cheek? With Roy Lichtenstein, it's as likely it could be tongue-in-cheek. At any rate, he has taken the text balloon and the text in it and changed it up a bit. To take that a step further, here are the bubbles from the character leading to the balloon. Well, that is in and of itself something that I would certainly at first blush look past. But to Roy Lichtenstein, these bubbles, these 4 bubbles, were extremely important in his selection of that work. Because what this represents, as we look at it, what he was interested in is that the viewer, the patron looking at this, looks at that and assumes that he is having a thought of, I wonder what this gentleman is like, not saying it. So the fact that we look at the bubbles and say he's thinking it, rather than an arrow pointing and assume that he's saying it, to the Professor Lichtenstein, this was part of his study of semiotics. And semiotics is the study, the use of symbols in place of vocabulary, in place of text, in place of words. And this is, to Roy Lichtenstein, was semiological and really quite important, as was the text balloon, was very important to him. So in part, he likely chose this work because of these balloons and bubbles. Now, let's take a little closer look at the window. Well, this is basically in the background of the picture. There's a yellow car back there. Not much to look at. Again, unless you're aware of the time. And at the time, the Green Gallery was being, people thought, secretly funded by Robert and Ethel Scull. Now, Ethel Scull had inherited her father's taxi company, and she and her husband Robert ran it. They were also patrons of the arts, funding the gallery, and hung around with various artists, not the least of which was Jackson Pollock at the time. They purchased a lot of art from these people and helped them financially go forward. In return, they ended up with a number of works of art early on that they much later sold for significant profit. So this perhaps is a bit tongue-in-cheek in that in the background, he's letting everyone know that he knows who's behind Mr. Bellamy's Green Gallery. Now we come to the character himself. This is a fascinating piece of it. Notice the dots on the face. And at this point, although we've seen it for a bit here, notice the dark black outline of the face. Now the black outline is not just from the comic strip, but we also can see a bit of Mondrian in this as well. And if you look at the colors in the background, you'll see that influence very heavily in this painting. The dots in the face were used by lithographers in cartoons to shade. The dots were known as Ben-Day dots, and the Ben-Day dot comes from the inventor, the late 19th century inventor Benjamin Day, Ben-Day dots. In the Mr. Bellamy painting, the dots are hand painted. Now Roy Lichtenstein later would use stencils, and he would stencil the dots on his works. He used these dots from this point on, but he would stencil them on or have his studio assistants stencil them in. But in this particular painting, these are painterly style. These are all hand painted. And if you look at them closely, you can see the irregularities of them. Now, the other important part about the dots, at the time this was painted, shortly after he painted this, he took this painting and looked Mickey to Leo Castelli of the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York. And Leo Castelli agreed to represent him, offer them up for sale. Within a few weeks after Roy Lichtenstein going to Leo Castelli's gallery and taking in paintings of cartoons, another up-and-coming artist in New York also brought in the same genre, brought in cartoons. Leo Castelli looked at the cartoons of the second artist, compared them, and told the second artist, "I'm sorry, yours are not up to par. I have these from Roy Lichtenstein. I'm going with them." The second artist looked at this painting, looked at the dots, and said, "Oh, yeah, wow, I wish I'd have come up with that. Yeah, I'll go do something else." Now, don't feel bad for the second artist. His name was Andy Warhol, and he came back later with soup cans. He did okay. This didn't really slow him down all that much. It is interesting, though, that neither artist knew the other one. They did become friends and certainly acquaintances, if not friends, later on. Certainly got to know one another and were important at the same time. We can see the dots showing up again on the sleeve, this time blue for shading purposes. And we see the dots showing up yet again on the pocket of the officer. Now, that said, this slide and the next one, if you look closely at this slide, you will see little streaks, little stripes around where the paint is. You'll see up underneath the wings, you'll see what looks maybe like a little line. Well, it is in fact a line. It's a pencil mark put on by the artist, Roy Lichtenstein. If you look at the buttonhole in the pocket next to the line, the vertical line, you'll see another vertical pencil line. That is Roy Lichtenstein's. He would draw his work on a piece of paper. He would put it in an opaque projector, and he would then project the image, the line image, onto the canvas, and then he would go up and trace that onto the canvas. We will see a bit later some further detail of that, and I'll discuss that a little bit further. But in this particular case, we also see the airplane. Now notice the dots in the background. Again, blue sky. But the plane in the original source image looked like it might fly. This plane does not really look like it would fly. This looks like a toy. Well, this toy image of an airplane had been used by Roy Lichtenstein before, so this is nothing new to him. This likely came to him, maybe as a child even, from a toy. There has been discussion that perhaps it was influenced by an Art Nouveau picture that he'd seen. But this is not intended to be an airplane that flies. This is intended to be an airplane that perhaps helps depict this as being an airport. We're back to the details, and you'll notice on the button, the round button, that there is in the upper right quadrant of the button a pencil mark. You'll see these if you are ever able to get in and see the real work in the museum. Please look for these lines. It's fascinating to see how he drew it originally and then would modify and vary the painting as he painted it. Also notice that one of the things people notice about him is that he did have a little trouble staying within the lines. However, in this case, most people have forgiven him. Now, this particular slide, if you look at it closely, is the original bill of sale when this work was sold by the Dwan Gallery, who had received it from Leo Castelli, and it was sold to a Vernon Nickel in Clovis, New Mexico. Now, Vernon Nickel was a mail carrier, postal carrier. This particular receipt is for the original sale, and the Modern Museum in Fort Worth obtained the paintings from Mr. Nichols. So we do know the entire travels, the entire life of the work. Also notice that this was sold along with an Andy Warhol piece, 25 Marylands. Of most interest to me is that he paid $2,000 for Mr. Bellamy and only $1,500 for the Warhol work. That brings us to this question that we started out with. Is this a copy? Is this an appropriation? And if not, well, what exactly is it? So to discuss that a little further, I want to discuss three other artists. First of all, John Constable was a British landscape painter, late 18th, early 19th century. He was considered one of the best. Fair enough. Let's also talk about Thomas Gainsborough. Thomas Gainsborough was a British portrait painter, considered at the time the best, still considered one of the best. Painted in the 18th century, was one of the founders of the Royal Academy in Great Britain. And finally, let's talk about Jacob van Ruysdael, a 17th century Dutch artist of the Baroque period. Thomas Gainsborough talked about the heavy influence that van Ruysdael had had on him and how he tried to emulate van Ruysdael. John Constable discussed the heavy influence that Thomas Gainsborough had on him. So the fact is, no one accused Gainsborough of appropriating or copying or stealing from van Ruysdael. No one discussed that with John Constable and Thomas Gainsborough. Now, it's interesting because in the book, The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich, he stated very succinctly that all paintings owe more to other paintings than they owe to direct observation. And in fact here, what Lichtenstein really had in mind was that he was paying a bit of an homage to Mel Kiefer, to these comic strip artists that he was always fascinated by, that he thought that their work was equally important. He had always talked about high art versus low art, and that he wanted to not necessarily be associated with high art, but to bring the proper respect to art that was perhaps at the time not seen as high art. So hopefully that answers the question about appropriation. It's not a copy, it's not an appropriation, it's perhaps an homage, but it is absolutely an original. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you've learned a little something, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully at the museum.